Welcome to the fourth in a series of sessions designed to enable your development as a teacher or manager. This programme is the result of collaboration between the City and Guilds Centre for Skills Development and the Centre for Education in the Criminal Justice System, part of the Institute of Education, University of London. This session introduces how to use classroom assessment activities to enhance learning. The contents and ideas are founded on recent research into effective teaching and learning, some of which took place in adult basic education programmes. The session is designed for teachers working to improve the literacy, numeracy or language skills of their learners. Although many of the ideas and techniques discussed in these materials are also relevant to any teacher. The session covers 5 main areas of classroom assessment: what classroom assessment is, what is meant by formative and summative assessment and the difference between them, what classroom assessment is for, how classroom assessment works, and 3 key types of classroom assessment. There are some aspects of assessment that are outside the scope of this session. This session does not cover specialist assessments such as for dyslexia. It also does not deal directly with qualifications of any kind. Qualifications may be one of the outcomes of assessments, but they are not relevant to this session, which is concerned with the use of assessment to support learning in a classroom or to develop a skill. To begin with, it is useful to share existing ideas on assessment. Pair up with a colleague and spend 5 minutes discussing the questions on this slide. Each pair should come up with 1 or 2 sentences to answer each question, as well as a list of classroom activities that enable assessment to take place. After 5 minutes, join with another pair to make a 4 and share and compare your answers. Are there any glaring differences or disagreements? Make a note of these and of any questions. Finally, each 4 can share their differences and questions with the whole group. The facilitator should take note of these and coordinate the discussion. From the perspective of researchers and experienced teachers, the purpose of classroom assessment is to help both teachers and learners understand more about the gap between where learners are and where they want to be. It gives teachers information that helps them to teach effectively. It is a formative process that applies to any subject being taught, and it goes on all the time. You might have some points to add to this from your own discussion. 3 of the most important aspects of classroom assessment are feedback, the use of questions in classroom teaching, and self and peer assessment. Pay attention to any differences you notice between your answers and these ones. Are there any questions? We'll be looking at these in much more detail later on in the session. Next, we're going to try and clear up any misunderstandings about the meaning of formative and summative assessment. Summative assessment consists of tests or examinations. Research suggests that too much emphasis on summative assessment can actually damage learning. It is possible for people to learn to pass tests without having much understanding of the subject on which they're being tested. The tension between passing a test and embedding learning is one of the things that makes a teacher's job difficult. For example, it is one thing for a learner to pass an English test, but quite another for them to use effective English to apply for a job. Doing sums correctly in a classroom or even in an exam is also quite different from using maths in daily life and work. Teachers need to support learners to work effectively in both contexts. Formative assessment takes a clear role in helping learners to understand where they are trying to get to and how to get there, and helping teachers to adjust their teaching so that it is more effective. Summative assessment is primarily about grading and certification rather than learning. As we have discussed, too strong a focus on summative assessment can compromise learning. As preparation for the next slide, it is worth noting down what you already know about classroom assessment and how you think it supports learning. This slide suggests what classroom assessment is for, what its purpose is. How does this compare with the answers you came up with? The purpose of classroom assessment is to help both teachers and learners understand more about the gap between where the learners are and where they want to be. The learners are trying to bridge that gap, but they don't yet know what it means to be at the end of the process. Assessment has to help learners to build their bridge in several distinct ways. It helps learners to understand what they have to do to succeed in their learning. It helps the teacher to focus even more precisely on the particular ways to help different learners. Assessment also helps learners to practice and develop skills so they can improve their fluency and their level of competence. The first step in the assessment process is initial diagnostic assessment. This is intended to begin the process of learning by helping both teacher and learner to see what the learner knows already, what they need to know, where they need the most support, what their strengths and weaknesses are, and whether they have any specific needs or difficulties. Ideally, it is more than just a technical procedure to decide whether a learner is entry level 1 or entry level 2. For learners with a criminal record, it is important that they understand the implications that their record may have for their longer-term goals, such as jobs that would be difficult to access. The CPD session on exit strategies has more information on these issues. You may not be the person carrying out diagnostic assessments in your organisation, but it is worth thinking, how can you best make use of it? This could be a subject for discussion with your colleagues. Research suggests that diagnostic assessment should have a formative component. Formative diagnostic assessment involves communication with the learner about where they are currently at and what they are aiming for. The information flow needs to be both ways between teacher and learner. With this initial assessment, the teacher can from the very start help learners to understand the nature of the gap between where they are and where they're aiming to be. Initial assessment can also involve summative testing and looking at previous qualifications. This helps to find out which level the learner is at and which class to put them in. But if this is not accompanied by formative discussion with the learner, then you miss the opportunity to start the learner on their journey. For classroom teaching, planning is needed to incorporate formative approaches and to make sure that assessment is continuous. The key part of this planning is to decide what it is the learners will actually be doing during the class, in addition to the content that you aim to teach them. This should mean that their work is more than just listening to the teacher. A good way of achieving this is to organise activities for learners that involve the creation of something, perhaps a piece of writing, a diagram, a role play, a presentation, a photograph, or anything that can be the subject of feedback and discussion. For continuous formative assessment, the teacher's role is to organise activities and observe the learners as they undertake their tasks. The teacher also organises learner assessment of their own and others' work and ensures that there is feedback on how the work could have been improved. How does your experience of teaching and learning compare to this approach? Now there's time to discuss how to give feedback. You could pair up and discuss these questions as a short activity. What are the purposes of feedback? Who gives feedback? When is feedback given? How is feedback given? And in what forms can feedback be given? Here are some of the key points about effective feedback based on research over many years. Focus on the task rather than the person. Be precise, constructive and practical on how the work can be improved. Be honest and authentic. The learner must believe you. Give feedback as soon as possible. Relate feedback to success criteria and the learner's goals. Set follow-up tasks to ensure feedback is acted on. Feedback should reflect high expectations of the learner and should not be patronising. Giving praise may be a good idea, but on its own, praise does not support learning. Do not give grades. How do these points compare with your answers to the questions you discussed a minute ago? A research study compared the learning outcomes of 3 groups of similar learners studying for the same qualification but given different kinds of feedback. One group was given grades only, one was given constructive written feedback only without grades, and the third group was given grades and written feedback combined. Which group do you think did worst? Think carefully about the reasons for your answers. The next slide gives the actual results of this research study and the conclusions we can draw from it. Spend a moment or two to reflect on or discuss what these results mean for your own teaching practice. Please refer to Activity 2, Giving Effective Feedback. Using questions and questioning productively is one of the most important factors in effective teaching and learning. Here are a number of questions to help explore how you would do this. Why are classroom questions asked? Who asks classroom questions? Who gets asked classroom questions? When are questions asked? How are classroom questions asked? Are some questions more useful to support learning than others? As an activity, pair up to discuss these questions for 5 minutes. There are all sorts of different types of questions that teachers can ask their learners. So first of all, building up a range of questions to ask, or the repertoire of questions, is important. The type of question is also important. To support learning, questioning needs to get learners to think. This means that open questions, or questions without a definite answer, are more useful than closed questions, to which there are definite right and wrong answers. A third point to consider is how long to wait after asking a question. Research suggests that most teachers will wait between 3 and 4 seconds after their question and then answer it themselves. If your learners get used to you waiting perhaps as much as 10 seconds, they will know that you want them to think about their answers. Remember that wrong answers are valuable. They provide you with information and a basis for organising the next phase of the class. If one learner doesn't answer, ask another. If one learner does answer, ask another learner, is that a good answer, or can you add to it? It's important to praise learners for giving an answer, even if it is not the correct or best answer. Many teachers' use of questions is restricted to, has everyone got that, after they have explained something. This is not a very useful question, because it doesn't encourage people to own up and say, actually I didn't get it. Using directed questions, directed at specific named individual learners, helps to tackle this. It is good practice to share out directed questions equally, so that everyone is involved in the class. You can also use directed questions to refocus someone who has become distracted. Encourage learners to answer questions clearly and loudly enough to be heard by everyone else. That way, questions and answers can help everybody's learning and they benefit everyone. This kind of interplay using questions encourages a cooperative attitude to learning within the class. The next slide asks, why does asking questions support learning? Before we look at it, spend a few moments in small groups trying to answer this question. Research suggests that questioning has a range of purposes as a key element of teaching and learning. To check learners' knowledge, to check learners' understanding, to focus learners' attention, to aid memorization, to encourage a spirit of inquiry, to develop communication and discussion skills, to challenge thinking, to encourage collaborative learning. Not all of these purposes need to apply all the time, of course. How did the answers from your group discussion compare with these? Did they have any different purposes for questions? Can you give examples of occasions when you've used questions for each of these reasons? Here are some of the different types of questions you might ask. Can you make links between the different types of question and the purposes given on the last slide for asking questions to encourage learning? Can you think of any more kinds of question? Have you used all these different types of question yourself? If not, why not try out one type you haven't used in your next class and see what happens? This type of mini experiment, a sort of trial and error procedure, is the most important way teachers learn and improve their classroom practice. You could discuss the results of them with your colleagues or make a note of them. See Activity 3, Classroom Questioning and Dialogue. Self and peer assessment is a key use of assessment for effective teaching and learning. Here are some questions designed to help you explore why this is the case, which you could take 5 minutes to answer on your own or in a small group. Here and on the next slide are what the research suggests are some of the strengths of self and peer evaluation. Self and peer evaluation helps learners to practice and develop their capacity to make critical, aesthetic and practical judgments of the quality and effectiveness of their developing skills and knowledge. Developing these abilities often implies the need to go beyond the formal requirements of the course. Can you relate these ideas to your experience of teaching and to the needs of your learners? The key learning objective here is autonomy. Do you agree that this is important? How important is it for learners who are on probation or at risk of offending? Why is autonomy important for these learners in particular? Here we have some ideas for activities for getting learners engaged in assessment and evaluation of their own work and that of others. These include spending time discussing assessment criteria, developing their own assessment criteria, imagining that they are the examiners, marking each other's work using the agreed criteria, giving verbal feedback against agreed assessment criteria, looking at exemplar pieces of work and discussing why they are of good quality. You could divide your class into 2 or 3 groups, each to undertake a task in a prescribed time frame, for example, to build a tower out of newspaper. The criteria for success should be agreed in advance. They might include height, stability, strength, beauty, and so on. At the end of the period, each tower is assessed by the whole group against the agreed criteria. This kind of activity encourages team working, but also helps learners understand how assessment works. Should they give grades or should they give advice? See Activity 4, Self and Peer Evaluation. This slide asks you to consider how the qualifications which your learners are working towards are appropriate and suitable for them. How well aligned are they with your learners' goals? How valuable will they be in other contexts, such as the labour market? Do employers value the qualification? How much will the qualifications help learners progress in further education and training? In practice, No qualification is perfectly suited to individual learners' needs, but careful and effective teaching can provide learners with much more than the qualification they are after. It can support confidence, autonomy, creativity and clear thinking, the sort of qualities and capabilities that help prepare people for an uncertain future which has lots of possibilities. This is why good teachers are so important, and why so many people remember the teachers who really made a difference to them. If teaching is solely focused on achieving the qualification, it is possible that learners will gain very little of these other qualities. To sum up, it is worth reflecting on what important ideas you have taken from this session. What will you try to put into practice in your teaching? Remember, you don't have to try everything at once. You could focus on improving your repertoire of questions, for example, or try waiting 10 seconds whenever you ask a question. Or you might think about how you can introduce some learners' self-assessment into your teaching. Ask your learners what they think. One interesting idea is that good teachers, in some sense, try to teach their learners to become teachers themselves. You help them to acquire good learning habits and attitudes, and this means that they can then help others do the same thing. It's a nice thought on which to complete this session. Thank you for listening. We hope that this session has included some ideas that will be useful to you in your practice and in your professional development. For more information, please contact Jane Hurry at the Institute of Education Centre for Education in the Criminal Justice System.